Coleridge, an ardent fan of Kant, I couldn't help noticing that some of the pages were still uncut. In this work, Kant reinstated God, who was no longer deemed unspeakable because he didn't fit into the categories. The Critique of practical reason is devoted to the ethical part of Kant's system. Here, instead of seeking metaphysical grounds for our perception, he seeks them for our morality. Kant was searching for nothing less than the fundamental moral law. But surely it was impossible to discover such a law that would please everyone, from Christians to Buddhists, from liberals to Prussians, all believing in the same fundamental good. Kant believed it was possible to discover a basic law, but he did so by sidestepping what most would consider to be the main question. Good and evil were not his concern here. He was not seeking to discover some essence of all the different interpretations of these basic moral concepts. Kant stressed that he was seeking the grounds of morality rather than its content. As with pure reason, so with practical reason. What was needed was a set of a priori principles like the categories. In fact, Kant eventually came up with only one principle, his categorical imperative. This was the a priori ground for all moral action, its metaphysical premise. In an analogous way to the categories of pure reason, this gives a framework to our ethical thinking, practical reason, though without giving it any specific moral content. Kant's categorical imperative states, "Act only in accord with a principle which you would at the same time will to be a universal law." This principle led Kant to believe that we should act in accordance with our duty, not according to our feelings, and resulted in some odd conclusions. For instance, Kant stated that the moral worth of an action should not be judged according to its consequences, but only in so far as it was done for the sake of duty. This is plainly daft, if morality is to do with society rather than just individual self-righteousness. Kant intended his categorical imperative as a mere framework, empty of moral content, but it isn't quite. It still contains traces of moral content, the morality of conformity for a start. Kant's categorical imperative implies that everyone should act in precisely the same way, regardless of temperament or task. Should the head of a government act with the same moral scruples as the head of a monastery? Should he even try? Should Churchill have tried to behave like Gandhi, or vice versa? Perhaps all systems are bound to lead to such rigidities. But without any ethical system we would be completely lost, unable to make any value judgments whatsoever. Kant's ethical system also led him to believe that we should never tell a lie, regardless of what consequences this might involve. He was well aware of the implications of this argument, but he stuck to it nonetheless. To tell a falsehood to a murderer who is in pursuit of a friend of yours who has taken refuge in your house would be a crime. Are we to believe that Kant would have delivered a Jewish friend to Nazis? No. Everything we know about him suggests that he would have followed the dictates of duty here. His highly active mind would quickly have discovered a duty which forbade him to hand over his friend. Yet this question of never telling a lie exposes a distinct flaw in Kant's system. For make no mistake about it, Kant took this business about lies extremely seriously. He even spent time agonizing over the question of whether it was permissible to end a letter with the customary greeting of the period, "Your obedient servant." Was this a lie? Kant insisted he was no man's servant, that he had no intention of obeying his correspondence, but eventually he seems to have relented on this matter. Yet on more serious literary matters he remained unbending. He was against the reading of novels. They caused our thought to become fragmentary and weakened our memory. For it would be ridiculous to memorize novels in order to relate them to others. The implication that Kant memorized all other books he read is not to be lightly dismissed. Here Kant overlooks the fact that reading Rousseau's novel Eloise was a formative experience, which he seems to have accomplished without exploding his thoughts into fragments or softening his memory. Kant enjoyed reading poetry, but only if it was an intellectual harmonization of virtue and sentiment. Unrhymed poetry was simply prose gone mad. Music was a different and altogether more difficult matter. Music alone could penetrate the carapace of repression that protected his unexpressed emotions, and in consequence he was particularly harsh on it. He detested folk music, such as his mother had often sung to him. Musicians were characterless because what they played reduced everything to feeling. He recommended that his students avoid listening to music because it would make them effeminate. Yet he couldn't stop attending concerts himself, until the day he attended one in memory of the philosopher Moses Mendelssohn. This struck him as nothing less than endless moaning, and he never attended a concert again. In 1790, at the age of 58, Kant published the third and final part of his monster piece, his Kritik of Judgment. This is ostensibly concerned with aesthetic judgments, but also with theology, and much, much more. Kant argues that the existence of art presupposes the artist, and that it is through the beauty of the world that we recognize a benign creator. As he had previously implied, we recognize God's work in the stars of the heavens as well as in our inner inclination to do good. As with his theory of perception and his ethical theory, Kant sought to establish a metaphysical basis for his theory of aesthetic judgment. He wished to establish an a priori principle that made our apprehension of beauty possible. Here Kant was on rather more shaky ground. It's always difficult to get a consensus on beauty. Some consider the Swiss Alps pure chocolate candy, finding spiritual sustenance in expressionism. Others do not. Such views are seemingly irreconcilable, but Kant was determined to bring everything within the bounds of his system. Kant argues, a person who describes something as beautiful insists that everyone ought to give the object in question his approval. The similarity to the categorical imperative is evident, but here it simply doesn't work, except in the personal pejorative sense. Once again we are faced with the conformity syndrome. Just because I find Francis Bacon's picture of a screaming pope beautiful doesn't mean I expect everyone else to do so. Kant goes on to argue that it is only through the unity and consistency of nature that science is possible. This unity cannot be proved, but must be assumed. Related to this idea is the notion that nature is purposive. Kant claims the purposiveness of nature is a special a priori concept. As we now know, this concept is not necessary to an assumption of the unity and consistency of nature, and even the latter are now questioned by quantum theory. Kant insisted that although we cannot prove the world has a purpose, we must look upon it as if it has a purpose. Kant didn't deny the evil, ugly, and apparently purposeless aspects of the world, but he thought they counted for a lot less than their more uplifting opposites. In the next century, Schopenhauer was to take precisely the opposite point of view, with perhaps more justification. In the end, neither the optimistic nor the pessimistic point of view can in any way be endorsed by proof, and remain ultimately a matter of temperament. Meanwhile, Kant continued with his indefatigable routine, and the citizens of Königsberg continued to set their watches according to when Kant began his afternoon walk, 3 p.m. precisely. Kant's view that time is all in the mind and has nothing to do with reality may have had something to do with his living in East Prussia. This territory was surrounded to the south and the west by Poland, which lived 1 hour ahead of East Prussia, and over the eastern border was Russia, which by its Julian calendar was 11 days behind the rest of Europe. The nearest people who kept the same time as East Prussia were 2 borders away, across Poland to the west, in Germany. Kant lived on Prinzessinnenstrasse, in a house that was demolished in 1893. Here he was looked after by his grumpy old servant Lampe, with whom he was capable of being equally grumpy. Everything had to be done exactly right. Lampe even had to help his master out of his clothes each night in the correct order, and when Kant went to bed, he invariably wore 1 nightcap in summer and 2 in winter, which could be very cold indeed in Königsberg, when the nearby Baltic froze over. In the manner of all persnickety domestic tyrants, Kant was always concerned about Lampe's spiritual welfare. Indeed, Kant declared that he had reinstated God in his Kritik of practical reason expressly in order to give Lampe something to believe in. Lampe may not have fully appreciated this. We have no evidence of his gratitude. It's a little easier to guess Lampe's attitude toward his master's unique philosophical method of holding up his stockings, by means of pieces of string which ran up through his trouser pockets and were attached to springs containing